Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Professor Sayed Mohmmad Morandi, a professor at Tehran University and also a former advisor to the Iran's nuclear negotiation team. So thank you so much for taking time on a Sunday to come on the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
So I was wondering to what extent do you think we might already be on the path to a second attack on Iran? That is, it seems that the Gaza ceasefire, well, it's not holding. We seem to be saying that, well, Israel bombed a little bit, but then the ceasefire back on. Lebanon is also under greater attacks. We see the Syrian proxy possibly being prepared for some future involvement. Indeed, the former ISIS leader is now invited to the White House to meet with Trump. And the talk again of Iran having revived its nuclear program. There seems to be a lot of indicators that that we could be heading in this direction.
Yes, everything is possible. And the fact that Jolani is going to Washington, I think, is significant. Uh, the United States has always wanted to use Syria after the fall of former President Assad to put pressure on Lebanon. And they've threatened Lebanon uh, in the past and have also implied that Lebanon may be taken by Syria. So that is a possibility. Of course, the Iranians are not going to remain silent uh, in such a case. And I think that Jolani would have to think twice about trying to destroy the resistance from the east. The situation in Syria is very bad anyway, and he's losing whatever legitimacy he had very fast because he's done exactly what the Iranians and Hezbollah were saying for the last decade and a half, and that is capitulate to the United States and work hand in hand with the Israeli regime. That was something that was said since 2012, 13, and it's all turned out to be true. But Syria is very fragmented and very weak, and the economic situation is quite horrible. The country is imploding, so it will be very hard for him to do much, especially if the a threat from Tehran looms. After all, Iran's missile capabilities are unstoppable by, as we know, but for the Israelis, but Iranian drones don't need uh, to be very sophisticated to do uh, catastrophic damage to Jolani, and he has no air defenses for even drones. So Iran would not have to use those missiles that are used for Tel Aviv to put pressure on Jolani. So that's one issue. But I think that Netanyahu will probably escalate at some point because that's what he does. That's why the first Lebanese war happened. That's why he attacked Iran. But it's unclear on what front this is going to take place. Will it be in Gaza? Will it be in Lebanon because he's murdering Lebanese citizens on a daily basis? Or will it be against Iran? A lot of people, as you know, have been saying that an attack on Iran is imminent. I'm not saying it isn't, but it would be very costly for Netanyahu. And the Iranians have been preparing themselves uh, at a very rapid pace since the ceasefire or the halt in hostilities. The Israelis have no means to block Iranian missiles, and Iran is working on its missiles to make them even more effective. And it is bringing new missiles into play. But also, on the other hand, the Iranians are preparing themselves for defending the country more effectively. In my understanding, although I'm not privy to anything secret, but my understanding is that Iran has already been able to do a lot to make sure in future drones will be less effective, and internal security will be more effective in blocking subversive acts from ISIS and Al Qaeda terrorists or other people who are used by the Israelis to carry out attacks inside Iran. So I think that as time goes by, the Israelis are going to find it more difficult fighting directly against Iran. But since it's Netanyahu, anything can happen. He would obviously pin his hopes on the United States entering the fight. But with the United States in Venezuela or near Venezuela, with the United States and its allies losing really badly in Ukraine, you know better than I that the front lines in Ukraine are beginning to show signs of collapse. And with the, I think, defeat of the United States at the negotiating table with the Chinese, um, it's not, I don't think the United States really has the stomach for an extended conflict with Iran, especially since, Glenn, this is something that most people don't take into consideration. Iran's defense capabilities are not directed towards Israel. A very small portion of Iran's offensive capabilities are directed toward Israel, the Israeli regime. The overwhelming bulk of Iran's capabilities are directed towards the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean. Why? Because when the United States invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq and effectively surrounded Iran, Iran's deterrence was based upon a potential American attack against the country. And the most effective way to block an American attack would be to destroy everything that the United States has on the high seas. And that, of course, would also mean those countries that host U.S. bases, they would be potential targets. So for every missile that can be fired at Israel, tens of missiles can be fired at positions in the Persian Gulf or targets in the Persian Gulf. And Iran has short-range and medium-range missiles, which are much more mobile and easy to move around to do these things. And as I said, in much larger numbers. And the same is true with drones. For Iran to target the Israeli regime with drones is quite difficult because they have to fly over Iraq and Syria and sometimes perhaps Lebanon to get there. Iran fires drones at Israel basically to make them use their air defenses because those air defenses are much more expensive than the drones. But if Iran wants to fire drones in much larger numbers, smaller drones, larger drones, at targets in the Persian Gulf, there's no way that they can be stopped because the Persian Gulf is not very wide and it's very long. So Iran's offensive capabilities are directed at the United States. And when you take that into account, I think it's going to make it much more difficult for the United States to ever make the decision to enter a fight with Iran because it would bring down the global economy and it would bring down U.S. allies across the Persian Gulf region. So that makes it more difficult, if not almost impossible, for Netanyahu to be assured that if he attacks Iran, the United States will have his back in the way in which he expects.
There seems to be a maybe over optimism in the US how they can manage the climbing up the escalation ladder and containing the conflict, because ideally from the US, I think they would like to see the use of local proxies like Jolani, Syria, to attack allies of Iran. And then if you have to escalate further, have then the Israelis fight the Iranians. But then, of course, the US assets would be off target because they're not involved yet. And then the last step, of course, the US gets involved, but then all its assets are also in place. But as we saw the last time around, things, the ability to have complete escalation dominance control, how you walk up and down this escalation ladder, I think it's often overestimated, and the delusion that one can control it, yeah, it's a common historical area of miscalculation. I wanted to ask about the
If I could
preparations.
just
Sorry,
intervene.
yeah.
Yes. One is that, first of all, the United States Armada in the Mediterranean is extremely costly. And having one armada in the Mediterranean and then mobilizing simultaneously for the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean is going to be a very big burden for the United States and the U.S. military and the budget. In addition to that, Jolani is already in serious trouble. It's not without reason that he went to Moscow. He went to Moscow, and his defense minister went to Moscow because of the very difficult situation that they're facing. The country is imploding. They don't have control of the South. They don't have control of the East. And in the North, there's very little security. In some places, no security. And of course, his extremist followers, many of them are very angry, and quite a few of them are disillusioned because they see his policies as not being in line with the policies that he was uh, promising a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, meaning, hardcore ethnic cleansing, slaughter, and the imposing of Wahhabism and Salafism. And of course, some of those naive extremists really thought that he was going to go after Israel, which of course was always nonsense. And again, it's something that Sayed Hassan Nasrallah and the Iranians were always predicting. They were saying that if these people come to power, they will be aligned with the West and with the Israeli regime. So he has many problems at home, and escalating against Lebanon. I mean, the Americans, if they want him to do so, they'll put some carrots in front of him, but there are quite a few sticks that the Iranians have. And he is also has been approaching Iran directly and indirectly to normalize. So if he was in such a strong position, he would not feel the need to approach Iran. And until 3 weeks ago, I know that the Iranians did not respond uh, to those requests. I don't know about the last couple of weeks because I've been traveling, but so far the Iranians have ignored him. And he does need Iran for many reasons. One is that Iran has many allies in Syria, across Syria, very large numbers of people, because after all, Iran had its own army, which consisted mostly of Sunni Syrians. And these people are friendly to Iran. And on the other hand, economically speaking, they need Iran because the refinery is built to consume Iranian oil. Other countries are still frightened also to send oil because the country is still sanctioned. And for example, the electrical grid and the electrical power plants are were made by Iran. So the spare parts many of them need to come from Iran. And without Iranian cooperation, life becomes all the more difficult. So it's not clear how much the Americans can push under these circumstances. And again, um, the the time is not really on the side of the Americans or nor the Israelis. As you rightly pointed out, that there's not a real ceasefire. Every day they're murdering Palestinians and they're murdering Lebanese, and this continues to anger people across the world towards the Israeli regime, and the uh, favor, you know, even in the United States, the mood against the Israeli regime continues to get worse. We just, if you just look at Candace Owens or uh, other public figures who've been active, they're tearing apart. Tucker Carlson, they're tearing apart the support base of the Israeli regime. So time is not on the side of the Israelis because if they do launch a war and the public in the United States is hostile towards it already, or if they escalate in Lebanon or against Gaza now, it's going to make things even worse. So it's not as if the Israelis have all that many options anyway, or good options.
It's development in the United States is interesting then, especially, well, there's been more criticism on the political left, but also now the political right being more and more critical of Israel. And I think this is an interesting development because with the arrival of Trump, he really got a lot of energy behind the idea of America first. However, he seemed to lose control over it because in his mind, America first should mean exactly what he thinks it means. But a lot of the people he got riled up. They thought that America first meant we're going to put our country ahead of all, including Israel. So when he now tries to shift it, saying, "Well, America first means to fight with Israel till the end," a lot of people have moved away from this, so shown that this America first idea has taken a life of its own, independent of what Trump wants it to mean. Um, I, yes, I wanted to ask though, the mutual preparations for on the Israeli and Iranian side, because we see Israel now being rearmed for another possible war. But in the Western media and among politicians, we all see that China and Russia has been criticized for assisting in rearming Iran. It's said this breaches sanctions. Of course, putting all the hypocrisy aside of arming one side, but then criticizing for arming the other. How do you see Iran being assisted? And also, the argument from the Russians and Chinese is that after the snapback sanctions and all sanctions on Iran are considered invalid. How do you unpack that argument?
Well, the most important thing about the joint letter between the Iranian, Russian, and Chinese foreign ministers to the UN Security Council and the open statement that they've given is that since they no longer recognize the UN sanctions against Iran, they effectively are allowed to export whatever they want to Iran. Because the UN sanctions were mostly about Iran's military program, its missile program, and the nuclear program. The Iranian nuclear program is indigenous, and it cannot be harmed by such sanctions. But Iran's military capabilities, of course, especially with high-tech uh, systems and high-tech technology, could be affected, would be affected. And by not accepting the UN sanctions, the Chinese and the Russians can provide Iran with whatever they want. Of course, there is a difference between Iran and the Israeli regime. One is that Iran purchases its weapons. It may get good deals, or it may get good technology because of the anger that the Russians have towards the United States, or the concern that they have about U.S. ambitions in West Asia, and the same is true with China. But they will pay. In the case of the Israeli regime, as they carry out genocide, they're being provided with aid by the United States and the Europeans. So they don't really buy very much. They're given weapons as gifts to kill Iranians and Lebanese and Palestinians, or Yemeni citizens or Iraqi citizens. So there is a difference. Iran is purchasing its own goods, but again, uh, the conditions, I would imagine, and from my understanding, are favorable with the Russians and the Chinese. And another difference is that, and we discussed this once before briefly, is that the Israelis and the Americans were under the illusion that an attack against Iran could bring about so-called regime change. And so the Israeli regime gave it everything they got. They had. They pulled no punches. And they used all of their weapons systems against the country that could be used against Iran and their assets inside Iran. The Iranians were caught off guard. So Um, and in addition to that, the Iranians never used many of their weapon systems. So effectively, the Iranians know Israeli capabilities, and they've been dealing with them, and they're trying to restructure their defense capabilities to deal with them in the future. But the Iranians have not used their offensive capabilities. Their key missiles have not been used on the battlefield, and Iran is, of course, building up its defenses by purchasing newer technology from, uh, especially China. Its technology is, of course, uh, advancing very rapidly. And this, of course, is an issue that we have to always keep in mind, that as the economic balance of power tilts away from the West, so does the military power. Chinese technology, Russian technology as well, but Chinese technology on all fronts is advancing very rapidly. While the Americans are heavily in debt and they're waging war after war, the Chinese are moving forward. So while there's always been an technological advantage held by the Israeli regime, that advantage is decreasing, and ultimately it could be reversed. And of course, that also includes Lebanon, that also includes Yemen, that also potentially includes Gaza. So the more technologically advanced Iran's capabilities become, that has an effect and an impact on multiple fronts.
That actually, what you mentioned about the US being overextended, that is actually also built into the America First argument that you can't behave as a global empire when you don't no longer have the capabilities. Because if they want now preparing for an attack on Venezuela, preparing another war with Iran, as well as a lot of the neighboring states, is still fighting an expensive war against the Russians, which they don't have the ability to produce enough weapons. They also have to prepare a possible war with China. I mean, once you're doing all these things, you can't really do anything. I mean, this is priorities are key here, and when every corner of the world is your priority and everyone has to be confronted all at the same time, yeah, you will start to lose ground after a while. And the Chinese, who are staying out of all wars, obviously they will be steaming ahead with their technologies. It does seem though that
So look at this from an Iranian perspective in particular. 20 some years ago, 2003, I think it was, that Iran was the axis of evil. And it was named by Bush as, the center, obviously, of this axis. Back then, the United States focused, at a time when it was much stronger than today, on overthrowing or bringing about regime change in Iran. It was the center of its global problems. Now, Iran is among many evil entities, and some of them are quite big, like China or Russia. So the United States no longer can focus on Iran the way it did in the past, and all of these evil entities are increasingly moving closer to one another. So U.S. capabilities are spread out. The capabilities of Iran are enhanced, and uh, in addition to that, all these other countries are moving closer to each other, thus providing new opportunities for the economies to strengthen. Because when you impose sanctions on Russia and Iran and on China and others and BRICS nations through tariffs or through direct sanctions, then you create an incentive for them to move closer to one another. So when you look at it from Tehran, um, Iran has the upper hand, and as time goes by, Iran's hand is further strengthened because these countries move closer to each other. The United States wears itself out, whether it's in the Caribbean or with trade wars, or now they're talking about attacking Nigeria. It's a madhouse. But of course, many don't even look at Trump's uh, Twitter feed. Well, it's not his Twitter feed; it's his Truth Social feed. unless they just want to look at it for fun. But the point is that if you look at the situation from Tehran, you feel far more uh, empowered today looking across the globe than you would have 2.5 decades ago. And then, of course, uh, there is the added feature that Iran has already experienced a 12-day war and it came out on top. And so the confidence of ordinary Iranians today is much greater than it was before the war. And also, Glenn, you've been to Tehran. Before the end of the JCPOA, Western Persian language media was day and night saying that when the snapback hits, it's going to bring chaos in Iran and the economy is going to go haywire. But it happened. The Russians and the Chinese, as you pointed out, said we don't accept it. And beyond that, it had no long-lasting effect. A few weeks after the so-called the West put their snapback into effect, and the JCPOA came to an end, the economy, the bumpy few weeks gradually ended, and things are back to normal. So there's no longer any real fear of sanctions in Iran. There's no longer any fear of what war would do to the country. So the country is more confident, it has more options, and it feels that it is moving in the right direction, whereas the Americans are moving and the Israeli regime are moving in the opposite direction.
I think what many people fail often to recognize is that, well, or remember, is that one of the reasons why the Chinese as well as the Russians reject the legitimacy of these sanctions, because the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, Iran did agree with it. That is, the Iranians said, we don't want nuclear weapons. They signed under the agreements to have their transparency. And they followed the agreement. It was the US that unilaterally withdrew from it. And of course, they were quite open about the reasons for this as well. They said, well, it didn't really cover ballistic missiles or partnership with allies. So essentially, what they're arguing is, yes, Iran is living up to the nuclear agreement. However, we would like to expand it to be essentially one of capitulation, to cut off ties with all allies, and also limit the conventional military capabilities in case, someone, not us, would want to attack you in the future. So this is kind of, so it is kind of very transparent that that this was on the US. I mean, it's very hard to make a counter argument there that this wasn't a very unilateral, and the Iranians even continue to abide by key components of this agreement. But now for the Europeans to do this snapback sanctions for what seems to be very dubious reasons, given that the Iranians were willing to open up its doors to the IAEA, one has to, yeah, question what the purpose of all of this is. So for the Chinese and the Russians now to say, well, we don't consider this legitimate, as you suggested, that also has to be seen in the wider context now, because everyone has to be sanctioned, and they expect everyone to abide by all their sanctions. So they want to put sanctions on China now. At the same time, they're asking China to accept sanctions on Russia. They also want to cripple Russia with sanctions, but they also demand that the Russians will uphold sanctions on Iran. And like all these countries which are being targeted now by the US are expected to also put sanctions on each other. At some point, of course, as you suggest, they will have to get closer together to cooperate on securing supply chains, the technologies, industrial cooperation, mere physical connectivity with transportation and banks and currencies and all. It becomes, I think, again, this is why sanctions usually work when they're moderate and short term, not put max sanctions on everyone all at the same time. You end up isolating yourself. This should be common sense. But I want to just ask, about you mentioned that the Israelis, that Iran came up on top, and some would say, yes, this is the Iranian perspective. But there was a report now on Israel's Channel 13 where allegedly a lot of generals and senior security chiefs had pressed very hard for a ceasefire because they were overwhelmed by Iran. Do we know anything else about this, or?
Well, before I respond to that, I'd just like to add that uh, not only are the sanctions against, or the tariffs and sanctions against China and Russia and Iran and others creating, not only are they acting as a catalyst to speed up integration and cooperation between all these countries in the global south or in Asia and BRICS and so on, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but they also uh, create fear because, for example, the Chinese, when they see the Americans are threatening Venezuela, and while the Israelis and the Americans are basically moving towards imposing or their will in dominating West Asia, which of course means where most of the world's oil comes from, that is something of great concern to China. They know that if the United States succeeds, then they will have almost a monopoly over global energy, and China will only have Russia left to to through which to obtain its energy, which is not a good thing at all for China. So this creates a further incentive for China to cooperate with Iran because the Chinese know that just as a defeat for Russia against NATO is a catastrophic, a defeat for Iran in the axis of resistance in West Asia would also be catastrophic for China. So the incentives work at multiple levels. And also, what has happened, and something which I should add, is that it has increased the fact that Iran was negotiating with the United States, and then the United States conspired to attack against Iran with Netanyahu. And the fact that Iran again signed a deal to cooperate with the IAEA in Egypt, and the Europeans basically rejected it, even though they were the ones who proposed it. All of this enhances Iran's soft power capabilities, not only abroad, but at home as well, because Iranians see that the government has been looking for a solution, yet it is the other side that has been devious and dishonest. So, and in the case of Egypt, Iran knew that the other side was going to reject the deal, but they signed it anyway so that everyone would know that the other side is not sincere. And when you look at what's going on in Venezuela, the United States is also, from my understanding of friends in Latin America, the United States is antagonizing people across the continent. So, anti-Americanism, if you will, across the world is rising because the United States is pushing on on all these different fronts simultaneously. With regards to the war, uh, what we do know, uh, for example, from Steve Bannon, who is a key figure in U.S. politics, and he is perhaps one of the two most important people in the MAGA movement, alongside Tucker Carlson, um, is that this, from what he said right after the war came to an end, and he said this on at least two occasions that I know of because I've heard these two. I've heard him in two separate clips say that the United States came to the rescue of Netanyahu, and Netanyahu needed a ceasefire. And during the last few days, Israel was being hammered very hard. And so the United States was speaking with the Iranians and trying to convince Iran to stop the war. And if you recall, Trump, it was not really a ceasefire, the Iran didn't accept a ceasefire, it accepted a halt in hostilities. When the shooting stopped, Trump said in the White House that Iran can now sell all the oil that it wants to China. Now, Iran has been selling all of its oil, and it's ever since President ever since President Raisi came to power, the policy was not to wait for a nuclear deal and to export oil, and Iran's was exporting at maximum capacity, but and that continued under President Pezeshkian. But the United States was constantly trying to cause trouble for Iran. And what Trump basically was saying implied the United States was not going to try to impede Iranian oil exports like it did before. Of course, no one trusts Trump and no one trusts the United States. The Chinese don't trust them even after um, this deal that they've had in Seoul, and nor do the Russians because he's always changing his position and changing his mind. But in any case, it's clear that Iran forced the United States to give certain concessions in order for it to accept a halt in hostilities. So if Iran did not have the upper hand, why would the Israelis stop the war? If they had the upper hand, they should have just continued bombing Iran, striking Iran, weakening Iran, pushing it towards so-called regime change. But the fact that Bannon says that the real story is that the Israeli regime was in trouble, I think says it all. And of course, I did see the report that you spoke of on Israeli Channel 13. But I think what Bannon said is probably evidence enough because of his status. He was, of course, the first chief of staff of Trump before they had a falling out during the first term. But his influence is key. And he and Bannon, like Tucker Carlson, he's deep. He's very well informed. In fact, hours before the war, maybe literally hours before the war, maybe even a day before the war, I don't remember, but I watched Bannon say on his show, just like he said later on after the halt in hostilities, 2 weeks before the fighting started, Bannon said, we're going to have a war, war's about to start. So even before the Israelis began striking Iran, or the Americans began striking Iran. I don't remember when this was, but he was informed. I think it was right before the U.S. strike. So he knew his information, his sources in the White House, in the Pentagon, and across the political establishment are extraordinarily good.
Yeah, one shouldn't underestimate Steve Bannon. On the drain, though, in the
And you know, Glenn, sorry for interrupting you again. This is probably the third time. Steve Bannon, he has been very critical of the Israeli regime. And when you add him to Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and so on, that shows that things are not good at all for not just Netanyahu, but for Zionists in the United States and the relationship between the Zionist regime and the United States. His statements against Israel are not as harsh or of the nature of Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson, but they are very significant. And taking into account his status, as you pointed out, that says a lot.
well, there's this well, I guess division in the United States, to what extent it is an asset or a burden. There's this famous speech by Joe Biden, it's 80s or 90s, where he makes the point, if there is no Israel, we would have to invent an Israel because it's such a great partner to um, yeah, to have some able to project force in the Middle East. But on the other side, you have those arguing that, well, not really. They are undermining us over and over again in the Middle East. So there's more seemingly shifting now towards the second, and in the era of America first, and also, I guess, in a imperial decline, which we are seeing, there is this instinct to begin to prioritize and making hard decisions, which they didn't have in the past. And once you look at it hard, it's more and more reaching the conclusion, it seems, that Israel is becoming a burden for the US. This was predictable, by the way, in the 90s when all the discussions about unipolarity happened. Everyone said, more, well, not everyone, many, the critics of unipolarity argued that it would be inherently temporary because it would drain the resources, not just material and blood, but also international reputation. If you remember in the 90s, well, for those of us who worked in universities, 90s and 2000s, or studied, were always introduced to the concept of soft power because the US was so loved, and the attraction to it was so strong that yeah, this was a power category of its own. Anyways, but now it's interesting that in the past you would need if, for example, the Russians are sending weapons to Iran, they would have to deny or apologize or cover. But only was it yesterday, Sergei Lavrov was asked about, are you supplying weapons to Iran? And say, yeah, well, we were sending some Sukhoi like jets. We're sending the S-400 air defense, and there's no need to apologize, or we done something wrong. So the whole power there is gone. I think people often ignore how extraordinary this is. That even now that they're trying to improve relations with the U.S., they're still not gonna bow to this kind of strange shaming. Anyways, my last question was just about the Gaza ceasefire, because much like in Ukraine, it seems to be based on the idea, let's have a ceasefire without a political settlement, and somehow it will hold. But we see now Trump almost encouraging attacks on Hamas if it's required. So they bomb a bit, kill some Palestinians, and then they say, well, okay, now the ceasefire is back on. And there's also a push now to have an international force, but it doesn't seem to materialize yet. How do you see with all this development, how do you see I guess, if you want to call it post-Cold War ceasefire, post-war ceasefire holding, actually? Because none of the plans seem to be panning out.
It's not going to hold. I mean, I don't know how long it's going to take for it to collapse, but this is not going to succeed. The very fact, the reason why we had October the 7th was because the Israeli regime was strangling the Palestinian people, and with this fake ceasefire, they're doing the same thing, only more intensively. There's no doubt that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they are building up their capabilities, their tunnel systems, and without a doubt, Iran is giving them whatever they need to do so. Without a doubt, Yemen is developing new technologies and new capabilities. And with the evolving relationship between Iran, Russia, and China, that bodes well for those entities and countries and groups and organizations that are allied with Iran. And of course, the same is true in Lebanon. And as I said, time is not on the side of the Israeli regime. The longer this lasts, the more they kill people. This comes out, and people continue to remain angry, and it continues to delegitimize the Israeli regime. People have turned against it, and killing Palestinians, killing Lebanese, none of this is going to bode well. And then we have a couple of things that may change everything. One is the collapse of the front in Ukraine, which I think this is very much linked to what's happening in West Asia, because it will have a huge effect on Europe and the United States. How this plays out, of course, is unclear. How the war ever ultimately ends is unclear, because even if the front lines collapse, that doesn't mean that uh, the Ukrainian regime will collapse, and you can have hostility for years, but a collapse will have, I think, a huge psychological effect on the West. And the second is the economic bubbles that people are speaking about, especially the AI bubble that is being talked about. And if the United States, if that bubble does burst, I think the consequences will be huge for the Israeli regime and all U.S. allies and the United States itself. It will, of course, have a huge impact on the entire world, but I think the biggest impact will be on the West itself. The Israeli regime needs the West to continue to exist. It needs it because on its own, it's an empty shell. It's completely dependent. It's not like Iran. As I said earlier, Iran is purchasing weapons. True, the relationship with Russia and China is evolving. There's more trade, there's more business. The Russians will give better technology, the Chinese will provide better technology, but Iran purchases its needs. The Israelis are completely dependent. And as Europe crumbles, and again, I don't mean to exaggerate, I'm speaking in relative terms, as Europe crumbles, and as the U.S. economy faces in greater challenges down the road, these should be major warning signs for the Israeli regime. So I don't see a situation in the long term which improves for Israel. It only gets worse because they have been delegitimized. Their economy is badly damaged. Their people are Zionists are traumatized. Hamas exists, Hezbollah exists, Ansarullah exists. Iran, as a powerful force, grows more powerful, but its backers are in trouble. No matter how you look at it, its backers in Washington, in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, in Paris, all of them are in trouble. And that is not good news for Tel Aviv.
Yeah. No, it's. I think it's important what you point to, how interconnected all of these conflicts are. I would put them all largely in the category of attempting to reverse the decline of the hegemonic era. But as you suggested, every time it intensifies, it only alienates more of the world. So no, it seems to be heading one way. People, just as a final note, I remember the unipolar moment. It was turned by Krauthammer back in 1990, and it's an article worth reading because it has a missing component in it, like the logic that is, because it makes the point, well, the distribution of power is unipolar now. That's just the way it is. We are gonna have to rule the world. One day in the future, it will probably be multipolar, and then we'll adjust. But when you read it, it does strike you that the pragmatism which is assumed, it's very flawed. That is, you can't run a country, a whole political class for 3 decades, assuming that it's almost your God-given right to lead the world, not just as the policeman, but the economics and everything. And then after 3 decades, then accept, well, okay, the Chinese are rising, Russians, Iranians will now just transition into a multipolar system. There was never going to be a peaceful step down from power and accept multipolar realities. And I think the chaos of today is quite a good indicator of this. So anyways, I've taken two, sorry, the final words before you wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's I've said many times before that I think two things have really cursed the United States. The United States was an arrogant power, as superpowers tend to be. Historically, it was arrogant, but it knew its limitations to a degree. But I think two things happened that changed the United States. One was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which also almost simultaneously took place with the U.S. victory against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. So the ghosts of Vietnam were all dealt with, and the United States felt it was militarily superior to anyone else. And its ideological rival, it never took Iran seriously and the Axis of Resistance, but its ideological rival had collapsed. So that made the United States much more arrogant. And so when the multipolar world began to emerge, the United States was no longer behaving like it did with the Soviet Union. There was no respect for its adversary. The United States felt that it owned the world, the entire world. It was in charge. And these rising powers, therefore, had to be dealt with a heavy hand. So the United States can't adjust because the mentality, in my opinion, shifted with the collapse of the Soviet Union and its victory over Saddam Hussein inside the United States in a way in which it became all the more difficult to deal with adversaries. So the United States was better equipped to deal with the very powerful adversary during the Cold War, but it was unable to deal with lesser adversaries initially. The Chinese weren't where they stand today. The Russians weren't where they stand today. The Iranians weren't where they stand today when they began to rise. But the intolerance of the United States with the gradual rise of global South countries was clear. And that, I think, is only intensifying or as I said earlier, acting as a catalyst to bring all these countries together and quickening the pace of US and Western decline, but also making the world a much, much more dangerous place.
Very much agree. And as the Bannons and the Carlsons and other of the America Firsters, I think they're recognizing that this is not a us versus them topic. It's indeed one they question to what extent any of this is in America's interest as well. So thank you so much for taking the time, especially again on a Sunday. So I very much appreciate it.
It's an honor, Glenn. Thank you very much for having me.